Alexandra Rivers stood at her bedroom window, watching the Florida sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Her first day as Palm Grove's police chief would begin in just a few hours, but she had already been awake since 4 a.m., her mind racing with plans and possibilities. The morning light caught the golden oak frame of her mother's photo on the dresser. "Look at us now, Mom," she whispered, touching the image of the woman who had raised her alone while serving as a beat cop in Chicago. 25 years of law enforcement experience had led to this moment, though not without its share of challenges and sacrifices. Alexandra smoothed her casual blazer, deliberately chosen instead of her uniform, and checked her reflection one last time. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step up the ladder. Her decision to spend the first day observing her new jurisdiction undercover wasn't conventional, but then again, neither was her approach to leadership. The Mercedes purred to life as she settled into the leather seat. Her brother had insisted she treat herself to the car after her promotion in Boston, arguing that sometimes success should be visible. Now, cruising through Palm Grove's awakening streets, she took mental notes of everything she saw. The small businesses opening their doors, school buses beginning their routes, and overnight shift workers heading home. She pulled into Sarah's Diner, a local establishment she'd researched before moving to town. The bell chimed as she entered, and the morning regulars barely glanced up from their coffee cups. Perfect. Alexandra chose a corner booth with a clear view of the entire restaurant, particularly the table where 4 Palm Grove police officers were having breakfast. Coffee Han, the waitress, her Namathag greeting Linda, appeared with a steaming pot. "Please," Alexandra smiled, ordering a simple breakfast while straining to hear the officers' conversation. Their casual discussion of patrol routes and shift changes told her more about department dynamics than any official report could. Officer Garcia, according to his nameplate, was explaining to his colleagues about a situation from the previous night. The kid was just skating in the park after hours. Instead of writing him up, I had a conversation with him. Turns out he's practicing for a competition, working extra hours to help his mom with bills. Sometimes we need to understand before we enforce. Alexandra hid her smile behind her coffee cup. Here was someone who understood modern policing. She made a mental note of his badge number. Her phone buzzed, a text from Captain Torres about the official welcome ceremony planned for 9 a.m. She'd meet her command staff then, but this morning belonged to observation. The real pulse of a department couldn't be felt from behind a desk. As she drove through different neighborhoods, Alexandra noted the subtle shifts in architecture and atmosphere. Palm Grove was a city of contrasts. Million-dollar beachfront properties stood just miles from working-class neighborhoods. Understanding these dynamics would be crucial to effective policing. She pulled over to watch a patrol car handle a minor fender bender. The officer was patient, professional, and thorough, exactly what she hoped to see. Making a few notes on her phone, Alexandra already began forming ideas for departmental improvements that would build on existing strengths. The local high school caught her attention as she passed. Students were arriving for the day, and another patrol car was parked nearby. The officer inside wasn't just sitting there, but was out of his vehicle, greeting students by name. These were the small interactions that built community trust. Alexandra checked her watch, still 2 hours before she needed to be at the station. She decided to explore Maple Street, known for its small businesses and recent growth. As she turned onto the tree-lined avenue, she noticed a patrol car in her rearview mirror. The next few moments would give her yet another unfiltered glimpse into her department's culture, though not quite in the way she expected. Officer Kevin Barrett drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car, finishing the last bites of his breakfast sandwich. The morning had been quiet, too quiet for his liking. 15 years on the force had taught him that quiet mornings often meant busy afternoons, but he was ready for some action. His fellow officers nicknamed him the Eagle for his sharp eyes and strict approach to enforcement. The radio crackled with routine updates as he scanned Maple Street, his favorite patrol area. The neighborhood had changed over the past few years, with new businesses and residents moving in. Barrett took pride in keeping what he considered his street in order, though his definition of order had earned him both praise and criticism from his supervisors. A sleek black Mercedes caught his attention as it cruised past the new artisan coffee shop. The windows were tinted within legal limits, but something about the car made him sit up straighter. It was too nice for this part of town, at least in his judgment. He watched as the driver smoothly navigated through traffic, making a perfect legal turn at the intersection. "Let's see what we've got here," Barrett muttered, pulling out behind the Mercedes. He ran the plates quickly. The registration was current, and everything appeared in order. Still, his instincts, or what he called instincts, nagged at him. He flipped on his lights, noting with satisfaction how quickly the Mercedes pulled over, settling perfectly against the curb. Barrett took his time exiting his patrol car, adjusting his belt and straightening his badge. He perfected what he called his approach walk over the years, deliberate steps that he believed commanded respect. As he neared the driver's window, he noticed the car's immaculate condition and the subtle scent of expensive leather. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a well-dressed black woman in her early 40s. Barrett's demeanor shifted subtly, his hand resting casually on his belt. "License, registration, and insurance," he said, skipping his usual greeting. He noticed a subtle shift in the driver's posture, not fear or nervousness, but something else he couldn't quite read. "Of course, officer," the woman replied calmly, reaching slowly for her glove compartment. Her movements were deliberate and practiced, as if she'd been in similar situations before. Barrett watched her hands carefully, though something about her composure irritated him. "You want to explain to me what brings you to this neighborhood?" Barrett asked, examining her license. Alexandra Rivers. The name meant nothing to him, but the Boston address raised his suspicions further. "We've had some issues with out-of-state vehicles in the area. I'm actually new to town," Alexandra replied evenly, maintaining direct eye contact that made Barrett slightly uncomfortable. "Just familiarizing myself with the area." Barrett studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Her calm demeanor challenged his authority in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "This is a nice vehicle for someone who's just looking around," he commented, emphasizing his skepticism. "Is there a problem with my driving, officer?" Alexandra asked, her voice carrying a note of authority that Barrett chose to ignore. "I'll ask the questions here," Barrett replied sharply. "Step out of the vehicle." Alexandra's hand moved to her phone, pressing a button quietly. "Is there a specific reason you're asking me to exit my vehicle?" Barrett's jaw tightened. In his experience, people who asked questions were usually hiding something. "Ma'am, when I give you an order, I expect compliance, not questions. Now step out of the vehicle, or we're going to have a different kind of conversation." As he reached for his radio to call for backup, Barrett noticed movement in his peripheral vision. 3 unmarked police vehicles had pulled up silently behind his patrol car. The sight of Captain Torres stepping out of the lead vehicle made his stomach drop. Something was very wrong, and for the first time that morning, Officer Kevin Barrett felt his confidence waver. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Maple Street as tension thickened the air between Officer Barrett's patrol car and Alexandra's Mercedes. Her phone continued recording silently on the passenger seat, capturing every word of their exchange. Years of experience had taught her that documentation was often the best defense against injustice. "I'll ask you one more time," Barrett said, his voice carrying an edge that his body camera would clearly pick up. "Step out of the vehicle." His hand had moved from his belt to hover near his chest, a posture Alexandra recognized as preparation for potential escalation. Alexandra kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her mind racing through years of training and experience. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every officer who would follow in her footsteps, every citizen who had faced similar treatment, and every chance to create meaningful change. "Officer Barrett," she spoke his name deliberately, having noted it from his nameplate. "I'd like to understand the basis for this stop. Your lights came on after I made a legal turn, and I've provided all requested documentation." Her tone remained professional, measured, every word chosen with care. Barrett's face flushed slightly at her use of his name. Listen here. He stepped closer to the window, his shadow falling across her face. I don't know how things work where you're from, but in Palm Grove, when an officer gives you an order, you follow it. Alexandra noticed Officer Garcia's patrol car passing slowly on the opposite side of the street. Their eyes met briefly in her side mirror, and she saw recognition flash across his face. He'd have been at the diner earlier. He pulled over quietly, some distance behind the unmarked vehicles. I understand protocol, Officer Barrett, Alexandra continued, her voice steady. I also understand Florida Statute 901.151 regarding temporary detentions, which requires reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Would you please articulate that suspicion? Barrett's posture stiffened. Most civilians didn't quote statute numbers, and her confidence clearly unsettled him. You're trying to tell me how to do my job. His hand moved back to his belt. Step out now, or I'll have you removed. Alexandra noticed Captain Torres approaching slowly from behind Barrett, his face a mask of professional concern. Lieutenant Martinez had positioned herself near Barrett's patrol car, while Sergeant Kim stood ready by the unmarked vehicles. They had created a careful perimeter without drawing attention to themselves. Officer Barrett, Alexandra began again, her voice taking on a subtle but unmistakable tone of authority. I want you to think very carefully about your next actions. Every word of this encounter has been recorded, both on your body camera and my phone. Would you like to revise any of your previous statements? Barrett's radio crackled to life. Unit 47, status check, dispatch called. Standard procedure when multiple units converged on the scene. Before Barrett could reach for his radio, Captain Torres stepped forward. Unit 47 is Code 4. Torres responded on his own radio, using the code for no further assistance needed. His voice carried a weight that made Barrett turn slightly. Alexandra watched the subtle shift in Barrett's expression as he registered the presence of his superior officer. But she wasn't done. This moment needed to serve a larger purpose than just embarrassment or punishment. Officer Barrett, she said, finally reaching for her credentials in her jacket pocket, I believe we need to have a conversation about reasonable suspicion, professional conduct, and the future of policing in Palm Grove. Would you agree? The color drained from Barrett's face as she held up her identification, the gold badge of Palm Grove's police chief catching the morning sun. Behind him, Officer Garcia had quietly joined the scene, completing the circle of witnesses to this pivotal moment. Lieutenant Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. Chief Rivers, welcome to Palm Grove. We apologize for this unconventional welcome. Time seemed to freeze on Maple Street as Officer Barrett stared at the gold badge in Alexandra's hand. The morning traffic continued to flow around their gathered vehicles, but in their small circle, the world had shifted dramatically. Alexandra took her time stepping out of the Mercedes, her movements deliberate and controlled. Captain Torres, she said, nodding to her second-in-command while keeping her eyes fixed on Barrett. I see you received my message about observing the morning patrol patterns. Her voice carried no hint of anger or triumph, only calm authority. Barrett's hand had fallen away from his belt, his entire posture deflating as the reality of the situation sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Behind him, Officer Garcia shifted uncomfortably, remembering their conversation at the diner about professional conduct just hours earlier. Officer Barrett, Alexandra continued, straightening her blazer, your body camera is still running, correct? She waited for his mechanical nod before continuing. Good. That footage will be valuable for our department-wide training next week. Now, would you like to explain why you felt it necessary to escalate a routine traffic stop? Lieutenant Martinez had moved closer, her notebook already out. She'd worked with Alexandra before during a cross-jurisdictional task force in Boston and recognized the teaching moment being constructed. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about transformation. Chief Rivers, Barrett's voice cracked slightly. I was following standard procedure for suspicious vehicles in the area. Even as he said it, He seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. Suspicious. Alexandra raised an eyebrow, her gaze sweeping across the growing number of onlookers from nearby businesses. Let's examine that. What specific factors made my vehicle suspicious? Please be detailed. This will be part of our case study. Sergeant Kim had begun quietly directing traffic around their impromptu gathering, while Officer Garcia positioned himself near the coffee shop to keep curious pedestrians at a respectful distance. The morning sun had climbed higher, eliminating the harsh shadows that had marked the initial confrontation. Barrett's face flushed as he struggled to articulate his reasoning. The tinted windows, the out-of-state registration, he trailed off, aware of how insufficient these justifications sounded in the clear light of day. And would these same factors have prompted a stop if the driver had been different? Alexandra asked, her voice carrying to every officer present. This is not a rhetorical question, Officer Barrett. Your answer will help shape our department's future. A young barista had emerged from the coffee shop, phone in hand, but Officer Garcia smoothly intercepted her before she could start recording. This moment didn't need to become a viral sensation. It needed to become a catalyst for change. No, Chief, Barrett finally admitted, his shoulders slumping. My assumptions were incorrect. The words seemed to cost him physically, but they carried the weight of recognition. Alexandra nodded, then turned to address the gathered officers. I chose to spend my first morning observing rather than sitting behind a desk. What I've seen tells me exactly where we need to focus our attention. She paused, making eye contact with each officer. This isn't about punishment. It's about progress. Officer Barrett just helped identify gaps in our training and procedures that we can now address. Captain Torres stepped forward, his experience helping him read the situation. Chief, we have the conference room prepared for your official welcome. Perhaps we could continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting. Of course, Alexander agreed, then turned back to Barrett. Officer, you'll be riding with Captain Torres for the remainder of your shift. I expect your detailed report on this incident on my desk by end of watch. Include every assumption, decision, and action, especially the ones you now recognize as problematic. As the group began to disperse, Alexandra noticed Officer Garcia's thoughtful expression. Something to add, officer. Just thinking, Chief, he responded quietly, about how many times we don't see our own blind spots until someone holds up a mirror. Alexandra sat in her new office later that afternoon, the wall of windows behind her desk offering a view of Palm Grove's downtown skyline. On her computer screen, Officer Barrett's body camera footage played silently while she made careful notes. Each pause, each word choice, each subtle shift in tone told a story beyond the obvious. A knock on her door interrupted her review. Come in, she called, recognizing Lieutenant Martinez's silhouette through the frosted glass. Chief, I have those files you requested, Martinez said, placing a thick folder on the desk. Officer Barrett's complete service record, including every citation, complaint, and commendation from the past 15 years. Alexander nodded, opening the folder. And the demographics breakdown. Page 3, Martinez pointed. We ran the numbers on all his traffic stops for the past 5 years. The pattern is significant. She hesitated before adding, there's something else. After word got around about this morning's incident, 2 officers came forward with additional information. Alexandra leaned back in her chair, studying Martinez's expression. Tell me. Officers Thompson and Chen reported several incidents where Barrett's conduct showed similar patterns. They never filed formal complaints because Martinez trailed off. Because they didn't think anything would change, Alexandra finished. She turned to her computer, pulling up Barrett's performance reviews. Yet his evaluations are consistently above average. How does that happen, Jessica? Martinez shifted uncomfortably. The previous administration had a different approach to these matters. They focused on numbers, citations issued, arrests made. Barrett excelled in those metrics. Alexandra stood, walking to the window. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the parking lot where Barrett's patrol car sat empty. He was currently in Torres' office, writing his account of the morning's events. Pulled his body camera footage for the past month, Alexandra decided. Every traffic stop, every interaction, and get me the complaint records for the entire department. If this is a systemic issue, we need to know the full scope. Martinez nodded, making notes on her tablet. What about Barrett's partner assignments? According to this, Alexandra held up a page from the folder. He's trained 6 rookie officers in the past 3 years. Contact each of them. I want to know what they learned beyond official procedure. A soft chime from her computer announced an email. Barrett's report had arrived. Alexandra opened it, scanning the carefully worded document. Between the lines of professional language, she could read the struggle of a man forced to confront his own biases. Chief, Martinez spoke carefully. The union rep called. They're concerned about potential disciplinary action. Alexandra smiled slightly. Tell them I'm more interested in reformation than punishment. Barrett's actions this morning didn't occur in a vacuum. He's a symptom, not the cause. She turned back to her desk, spreading out the various reports. Look at these numbers, Jessica. Traffic stops, citations, arrests, all showing the same patterns. But buried in here are commendations for life-saving actions, successful interventions, even a citation for running into a burning building. That tells me Barrett's not beyond reach. Martinez raised an eyebrow. You're thinking of keeping him on. With conditions, Alexandra nodded. Starting with a temporary reassignment to our community outreach unit. Let's see how his perspective changes after 6 months of working with the people he's been profiling. She picked up Barrett's morning report again. He had 15 years to develop these habits. We can't expect change overnight. But this morning created an opportunity, not just for Barrett, but for the entire department. Alexandra turned to her computer, beginning to type. Send out a department-wide notice. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., mandatory meeting for all officers. It's time to have an honest conversation about what kind of police force Palm Grove needs. As Martinez turned to leave, Alexandra added, and Jessica, get me everything you can find on our department's hiring and promotion practices for the past decade. If we're going to change the culture, we need to understand how it was built. The department's largest conference room buzzed with nervous energy as officers filled the rows of chairs. It was 7:45 a.m., and word of yesterday's incident on Maple Street had spread through the ranks like wildfire. Officer Lisa Chen sat near the back, watching her colleagues cluster into their usual groups, their whispered conversations creating a steady hum. Barrett sat alone in the corner, his usually confident posture notably absent. He hadn't changed out of yesterday's uniform. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept either. Officer Marcus Thompson, a tall man with 10 years on the force, noticed Barrett's isolation and, after a moment's hesitation, took the seat beside him. Rough day. Thompson asked quietly, not looking directly at Barrett. Barrett's laugh held no humor. You could say that. Guess you're here to enjoy the show. His fingers drummed nervously on his knee. Actually, Thompson replied, his voice steady. I'm here because 5 years ago, before I joined the force, I got pulled over 3 times in 1 week on Maple Street. Same spot where you stopped the chief. Before Barrett could respond, Alexandra entered the room, followed by her command staff. The quiet chatter died immediately. She carried no notes, no presentations, just her presence and purpose. Good morning, she began, her voice carrying to every corner. Yesterday, many of you witnessed or heard about an incident that will define our department's future. Not because of what went wrong, but because of what we'll do to make it right. Officer Chen felt her heart rate increase. She'd been holding on to her own stories, her own observations for too long. Around her, she noticed other officers sitting straighter, more alert. I'm going to ask something difficult, Alexandra continued. I want to hear your stories, not just about yesterday, but about every time you've seen something that didn't sit right with your conscience. Every time you stayed quiet, because speaking up seemed harder than staying silent. The silence in the room grew heavier. Chen looked at her partner, Officer Rodriguez, who gave her a subtle nod. They both had stories to tell. I'll start. Thompson spoke up, his voice carrying unexpected strength. He remained seated but turned to face his colleagues. Before I wore this uniform, I was just another target for profile stops. Now I wear the badge, but I still see it happening. And I've been part of the problem by staying quiet. Barrett stared straight ahead, but his hands had stopped their nervous movement. Chen noticed how he seemed to be truly listening, perhaps for the first time. 3 months ago, Chen found herself speaking, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger. I responded to a domestic dispute call. My training officer, not naming names, dismissed the victim's concerns because of her accent and limited English. I filed a report as instructed, but I knew it was wrong. I should have spoken up. More voices joined in, each story building on the last. A junior officer described watching his partner plant evidence during a search. Another shared how reports were routinely edited to justify questionable stops. The dam of silence had broken. Alexandra let each story unfold, noting names and incidents without interruption. Captain Torres moved quietly through the room, placing a box of tissues on a central table as several officers fought back tears while speaking their truths. "This is day 1, Alexandra announced after the last story faded. "From here, we rebuild. Not by punishing past mistakes, but by acknowledging them and doing better. Every officer in this room has a choice to make, be part of the problem or part of the solution." She walked to where Barrett sat. "Officer Barrett, would you share with your colleagues what you learned yesterday?" Barrett stood slowly, facing his peers. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of a sleepless night spent in deep reflection. "I learned that sometimes the person you're judging might be your boss." A few nervous laughs broke the tension. "But more importantly, I learned that every person I stop is somebody's boss, somebody's child, somebody's parent. And I haven't been seeing them that way." 1 month after the Maple Street incident, Palm Grove Police Department's break room had transformed into an unexpected classroom. Officer Barrett sat at a table with 3 local high school students, listening intently as they shared their experiences with law enforcement. His notebook lay open, pages filled with careful observations and insights. "So when you see those lights in your mirror," Maria, a senior at Palm Grove High, explained, "the first thing we feel isn't safety. It's fear, even when we've done nothing wrong." Barrett nodded, writing something down. These weekly listening sessions had become part of his reassignment to the community outreach unit. Each conversation peeled back another layer of understanding he'd been missing for 15 years. Down the hall, Alexandra reviewed the latest department statistics with Captain Torres. The numbers told a story of gradual but significant change. Traffic stop demographics had shifted, showing more equitable treatment across all neighborhoods. Complaint rates had dropped, while positive community feedback had increased. Barrett's group has been particularly effective, Torres noted, sliding over a report. The students' feedback scores are consistently high, and their parents are starting to engage more positively with our street patrols. Alexandra smiled, remembering her own doubts about keeping Barrett on the force. Sometimes the strongest advocates for change are those who've had to confront their own biases head-on. "How's he doing with Officer Thompson?" "Their partnership is unexpected," Torres replied. "Thompson's been taking him to community events, introducing him to local leaders. Last week, Barrett spent his day off helping at the youth center basketball tournament." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chen entered, carrying a thick folder. "Chief, the new training protocols are ready for review. We've incorporated feedback from last week's Community Advisory Board meeting." The protocols represented a complete overhaul of department practices, developed collaboratively with community members, civil rights advocates, and officers from every rank. Chen had emerged as a natural leader in the reform process, her quiet determination inspiring others to speak up and participate. "Excellent." Alexandra took the folder. "And the body camera audit system. Live and running," Chen confirmed. "Every stop is now automatically flagged for behavioral review if certain keywords or patterns are detected. Officers can also request peer review of their own footage for feedback and improvement." Outside, The afternoon shift change brought a new energy to the station. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing their patrols and experiences openly. The old culture of silence had given way to one of reflection and support. Barrett emerged from his session, walking alongside Maria and her classmates. His face showed the subtle signs of emotional exhaustion that came with deep learning, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Chief," he called as Alexandra passed through the lobby. "Got a minute?" She nodded, and Barrett turned to thank the students before joining her. "I've been thinking about expanding the youth dialogue program," he began. "These kids, they're teaching us more than any training manual could." "Go on," Alexandra encouraged, noting how naturally the words us and teaching now came to him. "What if we made it mandatory for all officers, not just those in community outreach? Real conversations with real people from our community. No badges, no uniforms, just honest dialogue." Alexandra studied him thoughtfully. The man before her bore little resemblance to the officer who had stopped her Mercedes that morning on Maple Street. His transformation wasn't just about policies or procedures, it was about rediscovering his humanity and helping others do the same. "Draft a proposal," she decided. "Include what you've learned, what's worked, what hasn't. We'll present it at next week's command staff meeting." As Barrett headed to his desk, Alexandra watched him stop to share a joke with Thompson. The two officers, once separated by a gulf of experience and perspective, had found common ground in their commitment to change. A text message lit up Alexandra's phone. The mayor wanted to discuss expanding Palm Grove's new training programs to other departments in the state. What had started as a tense traffic stop was evolving into a model for police reform, one honest conversation at a time. 6 months after the Maple Street incident, Alexandra stood at the podium in Palm Grove's City Hall auditorium. The room buzzed with energy as police officers, community members, and representatives from neighboring departments filled every seat. Local news cameras lined the back wall, recording what had become known as the Palm Grove Model Presentation. "Change isn't a destination," Alexandra began, her voice carrying clear and strong. "It's a journey we choose to take every day, with every interaction, every decision, and every opportunity to do better." In the front row, Officer Barrett sat next to Marcus Thompson, both in their dress uniforms. Barrett's shoulders no longer carried the defensive tension of months past. Instead, he radiated a quiet confidence born of hard-earned wisdom. 6 months ago, Alexandra continued, an incident on Maple Street could have divided our department. Instead, it united us in a mission to transform how we serve and protect our community. The presentation screen behind her displayed statistics that told their story in numbers. Citizen complaints down 60%, community engagement up 80%, officer satisfaction scores at an all-time high. But the real changes ran deeper than any metric could capture. Lisa Chen, recently promoted to sergeant, operated the presentation slides. Her promotion had come after she developed a groundbreaking peer review system that was now being adopted by departments across the state. Her quiet courage in speaking up had inspired a new generation of officers to lead with both compassion and conviction. But numbers only tell part of our story. Alexandra gestured to Barrett. "Officer Kevin Barrett, would you share your perspective?" Barrett rose, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. Gone was the man who had prowled Maple Street looking for targets. In his place stood someone who had learned to see the humanity in every face he encountered. 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer, Barrett began, his voice steady. I had the highest citation numbers, the most arrests. What I didn't have was understanding. He paused, making eye contact with Maria and her friends from the youth program, who sat in the audience wearing proud smiles. These young people taught me more than 15 years of traditional training ever did. They showed me that true authority comes from respect, not fear. Thompson joined in at the podium, and together they presented the expanded youth dialogue program that had become Palm Grove's signature initiative. Every officer now spent time in these sessions, learning to see their community through new eyes. From her seat at the side of the stage, Alexandra watched the faces in the crowd. She saw hope in the eyes of community members who had long distrusted the police. She saw pride in the faces of her officers who had embraced change. Most importantly, she saw connections being built across old divides. The event concluded with a surprising announcement. Barrett had been selected to lead a new training division, focusing on community engagement and bias awareness. His personal journey from that morning on Maple Street to this moment would become a case study for police departments nationwide. As the crowd mingled during the reception, Alexandra found herself back on Maple Street, watching through the window of Sarah's diner. Inside, Barrett sat sharing coffee with Thompson and a group of local business owners, the same people who had witnessed his confrontation 6 months ago. "Quite a change," Captain Torres commented, joining her observation. Alexandra nodded, watching Barrett laugh at something one of the business owners had said. "The biggest changes often start with the smallest moments of truth." Speaking of changes, Torres smiled. The mayor mentioned that 3 other cities have requested your help in implementing similar programs. Alexandra turned to watch a patrol car drive past, its officer waving to children playing in the park. "Send them our training materials, but tell them the real key isn't in any manual. It's in having the courage to look in the mirror and the wisdom to learn from what you see." As the sun set over Palm Grove, Maple Street had become more than just a location in a career-defining incident. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose growth over pride, understanding over assumption, and hope over fear. The street where everything had changed now pointed the way toward a better future, one honest conversation at a time.